Hey everybody, I wanted to take a few minutes and go through syllogisms and enthymemes. We're asking you to use enthymemes this week, and we explain what those are really well, I think, in the materials if you read the explanation. But the examples we give you are all enthymemes in a particular form, in a syllogistic form. And so I wanted to run through that, kind of take you to the final step, so that as you're doing this assignment, you will in fact be writing out enthymemes in their true form, pure form, I guess, the most easy form to use in an argument. And I think the easiest way to do this is to compare, or basically to clarify what I mean when I'm saying syllogism and enthymeme. And these terms can be defined lots of different ways. I recognize that. We're going very basic, and I'm going to use them basically as forms, not as not getting into the rhetoric arguments, but just allowing you to use them as kind of scaffolding for your arguments and your thoughts. So first, what's a syllogism? Hopefully everybody's a little bit familiar with this. Syllogisms generally, we're familiar with categorical syllogisms. There's lots of different kinds, but there's a major premise, which is a general concept or idea, a minor premise, which is the specific application, a more specific idea. Usually it applies to one particular thing. And then a conclusion, which logically combines some of the terms from both of those major and the minor premise. All right, so here we go. A major premise, syllogisms, are a form of logical reasoning. That's an overarching kind of big idea type of thought. The minor premise, Aristotle used every form of logical reasoning. Now it's gotten more specific to Aristotle. Hopefully you can see that we're now going from general to very specific. And then the conclusion, therefore, Aristotle used syllogisms. Sometimes it's helpful to look at syllogisms almost mathematically. So syllogisms are logical reasoning. We can say A equals B, defining different terms. Aristotle, I've now introduced a third term. So we have syllogisms, logical reasoning, and Aristotle. Aristotle used logical reasoning. You can see I've pulled down the B term. Don't get too caught up in the math of this if math frightens you, as it does me. Just using it to kind of break down the argument so that we can see the different parts. The conclusion then is, therefore, Aristotle used syllogisms. So can you see almost the mathematical reasoning here? A equals B, C equals B, therefore C equals A. All right. Roughly translated, now we're talking about enthymeme. So that's a syllogism at its most basic form, and there's we can get much more complicated if we wanted to. We don't want to for this class. Roughly translated, an enthymeme, and this is from your materials, is a Greek word meaning within the mind. Understanding this is significant for the logical arguments you'll use the enthymeme to make, because when you actually use an enthymeme, you generally leave one of the premises, typically the major premise, unstated. That part operates only within the mind of the listeners. And this is what we didn't really give you an example of. We gave you examples of enthymemes in syllogistic form, in the forms of syllogisms, which is perfectly appropriate, but not really how we use them. And so I want to give you some examples of the next step, which is what I'm really hoping you'll do in the assignment, is to give me the syllogistic form of the enthymeme and then the enthymeme itself. So here we go. Major premise from the materials this week. This is in the instructions to this skill assignment. Unfair policies should be abolished. Racial profiling is unfair. Racial profiling policies should be abolished. So we have, just as we did before, A equals B. Unfair policies, the A term, be abolished, the B term. C, now the new term, racial profiling is unfair. Back to the A term. Racial profiling policies should be abolished. Now you can see I moved terms around from the last time. Don't get too caught up in the math of this. I'm just trying to show you how the different parts work in syllogisms. There's got to be a connection of the terms from each of the premises in a syllogism for it to make logical sense. Don't get too hung up on that right now. This is the enthymeme in syllogistic form, and we gave you this example in the materials this week. What we didn't give you was what most people would consider to be an enthymeme, which is just a statement. It's just a sentence. Racial profiling policies should be abolished because they are unfair. Most of the time, very simple enthymemes follow this pattern of a claim if we're using Toulmin terminology, connected to a reason or the statements in support of our claim. And what's unstated? The warrant. I don't want to get too far back into Toulmin, but I hope you see the connections there. So racial profiling policies should be abolished. That's the claim. That's what we're arguing for. And then it's connected to the reason why we believe racial profiling policies should be abolished with the word because. And then the reason is they are unfair. And you can see how that comes from the syllogistic form of the enthymeme. They are both the same thing. Syllogistic form of an enthymeme and then the final enthymeme itself. Those are both considered for persuasive purposes to be enthymemes, but what we really want you to be able to use is this final form of the enthymeme. But we didn't give you examples of that. So again, just to reiterate, enthymeme means within the mind. This is significant because when you actually use an enthymeme, you generally leave one of the premises unstated, and it's just operating in the mind of the listeners. It's the warrant, again, this unstated assumption that you need your audience to accept in order to go along with your claim. You give them the reason for the claim, but again, you're hoping that they are making this assumption. It's the major premise, the warrant, in order for them to accept your claim. Let me give you an analogy. Enthymeme in syllogism form is like Clark Kent. All right, and you can see where this is going. So this is the syllogistic form of the enthymeme, a little more formal. And then we have the enthymeme as it's actually used, which is, of course, Superman. Here we go. Look at the syllogistic form, the enthymeme in syllogistic form. Major premise, if you never see two people together, they may be the same person. The minor premise, you never see Clark Kent and Superman together. Again, I've now tied it to very specific things. It's more particular. The conclusion, Clark Kent and Superman may be the same person. That is the enthymeme in syllogistic form. Same thing, but in a different form, and in my opinion more powerful, is the actual enthymeme. Here's our claim, Clark Kent and Superman may be the same person. Why, you ask? I'm glad you asked. Because that's just tying it together to the reason I never see them together. So the enthymeme itself in this particular example is Clark Kent and Superman may be the same person because I never see them together. What's unstated here is the major premise, that if you never see two people together, they may be the same person. And you may or may not accept that warrant. It doesn't mean that it's a strong argument, but it allows you to see where the weakness is in your argument by assembling them in this way, looking at them as syllogisms, and then also putting them as you would in a statement. We see these all the time. Enthymemes are all over the place right now because of the political elections. They are used constantly. Hopefully you'll start to look at them. And again, I'm giving you very simple examples that always use the word because. That is the most basic form of an enthymeme. It doesn't always have to have the word because, but there will be a claim and a reason. Here's another analogy. Enthymemes are like icebergs because part of them is unseen. Think about that for a moment. The analogy works. Enthymemes are like icebergs because part of them is unseen. That's what I've been telling you. Here's the syllogistic form, and that is actually an enthymeme. Okay, up at the top, enthymemes are like icebergs because part of them is unseen is actually an enthymeme. Here's the syllogistic form of that enthymeme. Major premise, if part of something is unseen, it's like an iceberg. Minor premise, part of an enthymeme, getting very particular to enthymemes, is unseen, usually, but not always the major premise. And then the conclusion, therefore, enthymemes are like icebergs. So now I've gone the reverse. I've given you the enthymeme first, and then the enthymeme in syllogistic form last. And you can do it both ways. You see an argument by somebody. If you break down the enthymemes into their syllogistic form, you'll be able to see the weaknesses or the strengths of the argument, where you agree or where they don't match up or where they're not logical. All right, so this is again from the materials. Here's one way to think of an enthymeme. Major premise, fundamental principle that ultimately justifies your request. We call them warrants a lot in Toulmin. Most of the time they match up to warrants. The minor premise, here's the good reason for your request. These are the statements that you provide us with on the case study analysis. The conclusion, in this case, it's the claim, the course of action you're requesting your listeners to take. This is, again, the course of action connected to the reason with the word because. That's the simplest way to think of an enthymeme. All right. An example from this week's materials. We give you this enthymeme in the materials. Major premise, and it's in syllogistic form. Remember, Mormons should choose professions that are honorable activities. The minor premise, growing grain, including barley, is an honorable activity. The conclusion, it's okay for Mormon farmers to grow barley. That's the conclusion. We gave you this. We told you it was an enthymeme, and it is, but it's in syllogistic form. What I'm hoping you will do is take the next step and actually provide an enthymeme, which is, it is okay in its pure form, in the Superman form. It is okay for Mormon farmers to grow barley because it is an honorable activity. Do you see how that is broken out there? The claim, the conclusion, the thing that we're arguing for is it's okay for Mormon farmers to grow barley. Why? The word because triggers that we're about to give you our reason. It is an honorable activity. That's this particular argument. There could be others, but for this particular argument, this is the statement in support of our claim. It's an honorable activity, therefore Mormon farmers should grow barley. One more from the materials. We should support the laws of the land. That's the major premise. The minor premise, enabling immigrants to remain in the country illegally, does not support the laws of the land. The conclusion, and this one's a little bit trickier, it's a little bit messier, I should say. Scott should not continue with his marketing campaign because he knows that some of the customers in the Hispanic community that First Security is targeting are illegal aliens. I changed the word most to some. If you heard me last week talk about this, you know why. Don't worry about it. But we've actually given you an enthymeme as the conclusion, which is somewhat unusual. This could actually, the conclusion could actually just be, Scott should not continue with his marketing campaign. It could end right there. We've given you an enthymeme here because he knows that some of the customers in the Hispanic community that First Security is targeting are illegal aliens. Another enthymeme be, Scott should not continue the marketing campaign because doing so is enabling immigrants to remain in the country illegally. Do you see how that then connects the conclusion with the minor premise, using the word because in between the two, the claim with the reason, and it's leaving out the major premise. We should support the laws of the land. We're assuming that our audience will accept that warrant or that assumption, and it's unstated in our enthymeme. Scott should not continue the marketing campaign because doing so is enabling immigrants to remain in the country illegally. I hope this helps.